Lodge, which, by the way, is owned by the Centennial Foundation and not the museum. The Centennial, we are their glamorous tenants. We give them an excuse to apply for grants because we do educational good work. They are in the middle of a $1 million campaign. They're halfway there. Your contribution in massive amounts are needed. Your contribution is needed. Okay? All cell phones off. Period. Mine's on me. And this is being videotaped. So if you are uncomfortable with your face being broadcast to the planet, turn around or leave now or something like that. I don't know the deal is going to handle all this, but okay. Are those online announcements?
Yes.
Okay. Now, Nancy Webster was scheduled today, but unavoidable circumstances have made that impossible. Her substitute is amazingly well qualified. This is Wendy Chmielewski. I practiced who in '89 got her PhD in women's history with a dissertation, Search for Community, Feminism and the Utopian Tradition in the United States, 1830-1915. Somehow, it seems pertinent to where we are right now. Several of her, by the way, she has been curator at Swafford College Peace Collection for the last 30 years. Thank you. Yay. Several of her recent exhibitions have been in 1915, 100th anniversary celebration of the Fellowship of Reconciliation at the Cade Library at Swarthmore. 1916, her hat was in the ring, again, Swarthmore Library and Lansdowne Public Library. Last year, quote, to end all wars, conflict, resistance, and relief in World War I, which sounds particularly pertinent to tonight's discussion. And her most recent exhibit is surrounding you here, and it's all about Mildred Olmsted. Wendy, you may take the floor now.
I'm going to try and keep my voice next to this microphone as I speak so you all can hear me. I know I can hear myself, but I know that sometimes people in the back can't hear that the microphone. Thank you for having me today, and correct that I have curated the exhibit, which you can see in these two cases here. And there is another, the Women's Internationally poster reproduction of it in the fireplace. And I believe there's another photograph of Mildred Scott Olmsted in the living room, and it shows Mildred towards the end of her life, but actually here at Thunderbird Lodge, where she had lived since 1924. And actually the exhibit is about both Mildred and Alan Olmsted, her husband. Both of them were peace and social justice activists who lived most of their adult lives right here in Rose Valley. Mildred's sister, Adele Scott, an artist, lived just down the road, and they're very close with each other. Both Mildred and Alan Olmsted not only viewed most of the changes of the 20th century, but were also participants in making some of those political and social changes around the world. Alan Olmsted was born to a middle-class family in upstate New York in 1888. Mildred Scott was born right here in Delaware County in Glenolden to a similarly situated family, and her father was a judge. She and her sister Adele spent most of their lives growing up in Philadelphia, where the family had moved. The world to which both Mildred and Alan were born and grew up was in one of great change. Some of the issues facing Americans in the last decade of the 19th century and the first decades of the 20th were some of the same things facing us today. There was a great division of wealth and poverty. For the first time in America, the urban population was growing larger than the rural population, which was created divisions, political and social divisions. Immigration mostly from Europe, and in-migration from rural parts of the United States, moving to the urban centers, strained the few social services and city services then available to populations. For example, there was little garbage pickup in poor areas of most cities. There was poor public transportation, little community health or safety standards. Safety standards for food, safety standards in factories and mines. So you can see that there was little regulation. Women, especially married women, had few legal rights. They could not legally retain their wages, even though they earned them, they belonged to their husbands. They did not have the guardianship of their children. Husbands could will that right away from their wives when they died. And except for some states, by the 1890s, actually in the 1890s, women could not vote in most elections. Women could vote in many school elections for school board members in many states, but that was about the limit of it. African Americans struggled against legalized discrimination, lack of access to public education, restricted voting rights, and outright violence in almost all areas of the United States, including the North. This was not limited to the South. Workers, especially in industrial jobs, had few protections, low wages, no safety measures, overwork, no 8-hour day, no breaks or lunch. It could be fired for any reason. And for women especially, there was sexual harassment from employers and from co-workers, and always lower wages than men for the same job. But for women and men of Mildred Scott and Alan S. Olmsted's generation, there were other great changes as well, with electricity becoming available in many urban homes. Transportation, although railroads had been built in the last quarter of the 19th century and certainly by the 1890s, cars and later airplanes, these are all things that the Olmsteds would have witnessed as they were growing up. They would have witnessed, and certainly airplanes by the second decade of the 20th century. They also would have witnessed changes in communication, the invention of radio, movies, even talkies, and telephones everywhere. Just a few of the everyday devices that came available as Mildred and Alan reached adulthood. The escalator, skyscrapers, the fountain pen, the zipper, and the X-ray machine. And of course, later on, as we know, things like antibiotics too, but not while they were, when they were young adults. Social changes. Growth of the civil service as local, state, and federal governments began to provide more services, such as public water, public sewage, food safety, city playgrounds for children, and as workers began to organize in unions for rights and to forge alliances with middle-class reformers, Immigrants and African Americans began to gain better access to education and the professions. And in some areas of the country, women also began to gain rights, with universal suffrage finally being gained in 1920. Even before gaining all suffrage rights, a battle still yet to be won for women, women did gain access to higher education through women's colleges and institutions such as Cornell University institutions and public universities, especially in the Midwest. Mildred Scott was among the third generation of women to attend college. She attended Smith College in Massachusetts and graduated with a BA. She later attended the new Bryn Mawr School of Social Work, intending to become a full-time social worker. Social work was a relatively new profession, and while one of Mildred's heroines, Jane Addams, was really the founder of that profession, and this was someone that Mildred would meet later on, perhaps. She certainly worked in the same organizations. Addams was known as the founder of Hull House in Chicago, a social settlement agency. And social settlements were providing services for people without many resources living in cities. And they were kind of a bridge between having nothing and having some of the services that cities had yet to provide. Anyway, so Mildred intended to become a full-time social worker. And she did work at some point in social work in Philadelphia, helping to provide those services. Social work also provided its students with an intellectual framework to understand their world and the relationships between people. And Mildred would later take this on to extend it to understanding relationships between people of different nations. Mildred Olmsted attended Harvard University in the first decade of the 20th century, no longer the educational institution for the sons of the elite. Women could not yet go to Harvard. Young men from modest backgrounds, like Mildred Olmsted, also began to attend. After graduating with an undergraduate degree, Mildred Olmsted also attended Harvard Law School. Like Mildred Scott, Mildred Olmsted wanted an intellectual framework and a profession which would allow him to make a change in the world, and so he chose the law. In the winter of 1911, while he was still in law school, Mildred Olmsted risked his career to help make such changes. As the founder of the Harvard Men's Women's Suffrage Association, he invited the British suffragist Emmeline Pankhurst to speak at the university. The Harvard Board of Directors were not amused. Pankhurst was one of the militant band of suffragists in Great Britain, being one of the founders of the Women's Social and Political Union, known for chaining themselves to the fence at the Houses of Parliament, destroying golf courses with acid, blowing up mailboxes, and other acts of property destruction. Pankhurst herself had been often arrested and imprisoned, enduring being force-fed in prison many times. The Swarthmore College graduate Alice Paul had traveled to England after her graduation from the college in 1904, I think it was, and joined the WSBU under Pankhurst. She would return to the U.S. to lead militant suffragists in the U.S. at this time, about 1912. During World War I, Paul and her colleagues from the National Women's Party picketed the White House, wanting President Wilson to, if he was going to fight for democracy abroad, then there should be democracy at home, and women should have the vote. They also were arrested and force-fed in prison. Anyway, Mildred Olmsted managed to be expelled from Harvard and graduated to join a law practice in Philadelphia. The changes in the early 20th century did not come about by themselves, but because hundreds of thousands of men and women, just like Mildred Scott and Alan Olmsted, worked for those changes, some of them temporarily in some organizations, some of them throughout their lives. August of 1914 saw the outbreak of war in Europe between Great Britain, France, Belgium, against Germany, the Austro-Hungarian, and Ottoman empires. It soon became a global conflict. The desire for peace was strong in the US. Many regarded war itself, not just World War I, as it became, as barbaric, the destroyer of what they wanted to build, a new civilization in the new 20th century. The American peace movement and other parts of the population in the United States managed to convince their lawmakers, including President Wilson, to stay out of the war until April of 1917. There was still major conflict in the US about the war and about who should be fighting and what the US should be doing. But with over 100,000 other young men, Alan Olmsted enlisted and joined the American Expeditionary Force, bound for France by the following year. He was part of an engineering corps. I'm not sure if he ever saw a battle, but he was certainly part of the military. Mildred Scott wanted to help out the civilians in Europe, and she joined others, young women like herself and young men, to help civilian populations on both sides of a landscape devastated by 4 years of brutal war. And there's a postcard in the case, just to give you an idea of what some of the towns and villages in France and Belgium would look like after 4 years of bombardment, and what both Mildred Scott and Alan Olmsted would have seen. Famine also struck the populations of Germany, Russia, and Poland. Mildred Scott worked with the American Friends Service Committee and the YMCA in providing some of those relief services to thousands of children and adults in France and Germany. And she performed other services as well. It was in France that Mildred Scott and Alan Olmsted met and began to get to know each other. The worldview of both was changed by the war, and they both concluded that war must be stopped, and that they would both try and work for the kind of society, not only in peace, but other social justice and for the rights of men as well. They had witnessed the devastation caused by this war, and that 10 to 15 million people, the deaths of 10 to 15 million people, soldiers and civilians. Another 30 million, perhaps, would die from the flu epidemics of the 1917 to 1920. Of course, that didn't strike just civilians, but didn't strike just military, but civilians all over the world. It's not quite known how the flu epidemic spread, but certainly it seems like the movement of so many men and materials around the world was part of the reason that it could spread so quickly. Both Mildred Scott and Alan Olmsted did spend the rest of their lives opposing war and militarism and working for social justice and a progressive society. They met back again in Philadelphia afterwards and had a courtship. And in 1921, they married. And in 1924, moved here to Thunderbird Lodge, where they spent both the rest of their lives. Once they returned, they both soon began to join other peace activists and social justice activists. They didn't waste any time. Mildred Scott Olmsted now joined the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. The Women's International League, it was an international organization, still is, now in the 104th year of its existence. It had been organized in 1915 with a conference at The Hague of women from neutral and belligerent nations meeting to try and organize a path for the ending, how to start negotiations to end World War I. In the United States, it was known in 1915 as the Women's Peace Party, and the first president was Jane Addams in Chicago. But they had branches all over the country. Addams was well known. She was probably the best known of international figures. She had founded Hull House in Chicago in 1889. It soon became a place not only providing social services like a nursery, a library, a place for people to meet, but they also had started a theater. They had classes for immigrants. They had meeting space for labor activists, and they had places where immigrants could practice their crafts, like pottery and so on. There's still some very well-known pottery that came out of Hull House that you can still find today. Addams would also become one of the founding members of the NAACP, as well as some other organizations. So she was well known. She was well known internationally. So she became the first president of the Women's International League, which was reorganized in 1919. It's possible, we don't know for sure, if in 1919 that Mildred Olmsted met Jane Addams when she asked Addams to, when she was in France, to come and help explain some of the peace theories that she had to some of the members of the military that Mildred was working with. But when they came back, Mildred joined the Pennsylvania branch. There were local branches of the Women's International League, and she worked with the organization for the rest of her life. But in the Pennsylvania branch, the Women's International League in the 1920s was trying to find support for the League of Nations, which was organizing. They were interested in anti-militarism and stopping the build-up of military all over the world. They were interested in disarmament and supported disarmament conferences. They were also interested in women's rights. There were countries around the world that women still did not have the right to vote, and they supported those rights all over. They also worked on citizenship rights for women, because women at that time, when they married, automatically gained the citizenship of their husbands. And after World War I, there were some countries that no longer existed as they had before the war. So what was their citizenship going to be? Even if they'd been born, let's say, in Great Britain or in the United States, if they married a man from another country, their citizenship rights changed. And in wartime, that became very difficult. Alan Olmsted also started joining organizations. One of the first he joined was the Philadelphia Peace Council. Another was the American Civil Liberties Union, which during World War I had been very active in protecting the civil liberties of those who spoke out against the war in the United States. The Wilson administration had managed to pass two acts, the Sedition Act and the Espionage Act, and anybody who spoke out against the war was liable to arrest. So the ACLU began its life sort of as an anti-war organization protecting the rights of those who spoke out against war. During World War I, the Russian government at the time had also fallen and had become a communist nation. The Bolsheviks had taken over. And the Women's International League also fought for the recognition of the Soviet Union as well. It became, communism even in the 1920s, became an issue of the United States, seeing that a lot of radicals, whom the government assumed were radicals, and progressives were accused of being communists, and some were hounded as well. Alan also, and Mildred as well, also joined the birth control league. They were very interested in the right of people to have access to birth control, which was considered should not be accessible to most people, maybe to married people, but maybe not. Alan also joined the National Council for Prevention of War, which is a national organization that grew massively in the 1920s and 30s. He also joined the Democratic Party and very quickly became in local Democratic politics. In the late 1920s, he ran for the state legislature unsuccessfully, eventually becoming a judge in the 1950s, but he was very active in politics. So in 1932, just jumping ahead just a little bit, as Mildred became more and more active with the Women's International League, she and Alan organized a trip for the Women's International League members and supporters to the new Soviet Union called the Open Road. You'll see a brochure in there. Many progressives in the United States saw the Soviet Union, this new socialist state, as embodying some of the progressive social and cultural and political ideals that they had espoused for many decades. This trip was seen as a wonderful opportunity to travel to the Soviet Union and some other socialist countries like Finland. Both Alan and Mildred joined the trip, as well as Mildred's friend from Smith College, Ruth Mellor, and you can see a photograph from the trip in the case. You'll also see in that case that there is a letter from Mildred's FBI file. So in 1961, there's a letter from the FBI saying, well, we're not sure if we need to investigate Mildred, but you know, she took that trip to the Soviet Union in 1932, and that's somewhat suspicious. So we know several things. One is the FBI was watching Mildred, that they were not quite sure if she was a dangerous communist, but they had been watching her for over 30 years at that point. We also know, because the files are in the Sovkhatov Peace Collection, that the Justice Department was watching the Women's International League from its earliest days in 1950, and we're not quite sure how long. We know at least until the 1970s. That file, many, many thousands and thousands of pages. And we also know that in that file there are things as innocuous as the FBI reporting that the Women's International League was going to have their next meeting at such and such a time. That had to be reported, even though, of course, they were public meetings. And also that so-and-so had donated money to the Philadelphia Opera. That also was obviously important information to have. Anyway, Mildred continued to work her way up through the leadership of the Pennsylvania branch, becoming more and more important, becoming the president of the branch. And this was many thousands of people and many branches all over the state. There's a very nice hand-painted document in there, award to Mildred in the early 1940s from the Pennsylvania branch, so thanking her for her service. Both of them, both Alan and Mildred, continue to travel many, many places. Not only did they go to the Soviet Union, but they also traveled to Asia, to the Middle East, to Europe, almost every continent over the years. For example, Mildred attended, both for their social and political reasons, but also for just for interest, because they were interested in knowing the world. And in 1937, Mildred joined the Women's International League for the last international conference before World War II that was held in Czechoslovakia. During World War II, of course, it became again difficult to criticize the U.S. government for entering the war that was mostly fought in Europe and Asia. Both Mildred and Alan worked on perhaps what you might think of as side issues, particularly on a conscientious objection. There were about 75,000 conscientious objectors, men who had been drafted in the United States during World War II. About 25,000 of them were found not to be fit to serve for physical reasons. About another 25,000 or so, 28,000 perhaps, served in the military non-combatant roles, medics, cooks, clerical positions, and so on. Another 12,000 performed alternative service in civilian public service camps all over the United States. They did things like take care of national parks. Some of them were smoke jumpers, that is, jumping into forest fires with a parachute, a leather jacket, a helmet, and an axe, basically. Others were human guinea pigs in medical experiments. And others worked in hospitals for the mentally ill, where they eventually revealed in Life magazine some of the conditions that were still existed in hospitals for the mentally ill, which were horrible. People were kept naked, no clothes, hardly any food, were washed down with hoses and so on. It wasn't easy to become a conscientious objector during World War II, and some people's rights were eliminated. There were men who refused to perform alternative service, and many of those served federal prison terms, 1 to 3 years in federal prison. Some of those men went on to become the leaders of the peace movement in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And also served in the civil rights movement too, I should say. I don't think many people know, but during World War II, there was a congressional move to try and conscript women. And Mildred, as kind of an offshoot of her work with the Women's International League, headed an organization that was called the Committee to Oppose the Conscription of Women. And she was very active with this, and I think there's a brochure from a radio program in the case that you will see there. Their arguments are interesting of why women should not serve. So the idea was that women would be conscripted into a civilian labor force, and that nurses would be conscripted into the military. Their arguments were feminist, anti-racist, and in favor of labor rights, and I'll explain. The military said that they didn't have enough nurses, but what they really meant was, we don't have enough white nurses to serve white military personnel in white-owned hospitals. Mildred and the Women's International League, under the Committee to Oppose the Conscription of Women, said, yes, you do. There are a lot of Negro nurses who are already ready in the military or are willing to serve. They will enlist. But you're keeping them in hospitals that only serve colored or Negro soldiers. If you integrated the military, integrated those hospitals, you would have enough nurses now. Their labor argument was, If you conscript women into a civilian workforce, they will, and it will be women 18 to 55, by the way, you would have a civilian workforce at the mercy of corporations who would move women around as they wished, as the corporations wished. They would have no rights necessarily to equal wages. They would have no rights to their working or living conditions. And their feminist arguments were that this was militarism, this is what Germany did, and that women had just come out from under the thumb of men, had only had the vote and full rights since 1920. And here was the US Congress proposing to put women back under the thumb of men in a militarist, and she were to use the word patriarchal format. Her fourth argument was kind of interesting, and I think demonstrates Mildred's training as a social worker. She said that there were girls, teenage girls, who needed their mothers because they were becoming juvenile delinquents. And what she meant by that, by juvenile delinquency, was that young women, teenage women, were being seduced by the excitement of young men and soldiers coming into their communities. So they were going out dancing, they were going out to parties, they were meeting men that their families didn't know, and that this was an issue. This was a serious social issue, and might even spread sexually transmitted diseases. And so mothers were needed at home because, of course, fathers were off fighting. So this was their other argument. And indeed, the bill did die. There was no conscription of women for it. There was quite a lot of support against it. There were other women's organizations besides this one that didn't support it. Even though Eleanor Roosevelt said that she thought that women should serve in this conscripted workforce. After World War II, Mildred began to take over the national leadership of the National Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. Her colleague who had been the leader, Dorothy Detzer, who had been a very sophisticated Washington lobbyist. She was also a socialist, a Quaker. She had also been a relief worker, but she was a different kind of leader than Mildred. But she retired, and she actually retired to get married. And Mildred basically had worked her way up to being on the national board and the national leadership positions of the Women's International League. So she kind of left the Pennsylvania branch for a bigger role. During the Cold War, after World War II, the Women's International League, like many other progressive organizations, faced charges of communism, of being fellow travelers, and came up against the issues of McCarthyism. And Mildred had to negotiate this large national organization against these charges. Some organizations purged their communist members. Communism, even though it became kind of a sort of a quasi-legal status, had been very popular amongst progressives in the 1930s. But by the 1950s, it was only equated with this kind of enemy of democracy supported by the Soviet Union. So Mildred had to negotiate all of this. The Women's International refused to purge their communist members, and they basically said, well, we don't support class war, so anybody who really is a full member of the Women's International League couldn't really be a communist. They couldn't be a member of the Communist Party because the two would be antithetical. So they never purged their communism, even though they knew some of the women were. Now, that's not to say that some of the Women's International League members were also FBI informants, and I'm afraid some were. And we have documents of, of this contention. Are we going to be full Americans, or are we going to be internationalists, or are we going to be supporters of communism? So again, this is the kind of organization that Mildred was kind of trying to support and negotiate. One of the other big issues that started to rise in the 1950s, of course, was civil rights. And we do know that women in the Women's International were very much involved in this issue as well. Women from northern branches would travel to the south to help. Women in the south organized branches as well. And most of them were very much organized in supporting the rights to vote, integration, school integration, and so on. Of course, they also supported the rise of the United Nations. And the Women's International League is today a non-governmental organization at the UN and has that status. But this is when this was all forming. So again, Mildred's involved not only in the national branch, but in the international as well. Alan, of course, at this time is also working. He'd always actually been the legal counsel for free for the Women's International League when they needed legal help. And so he worked at that, and his law practice, and democratic politics. He also became a member of the American Friends Service Committee and worked on their rights of conscience committees. He became a member of the Central Committee for Conscientious Objection, again, helping those who objected to being part of what was, by the 1950s, a peacetime universal military training requirement for young men. And he too fought battles about McCarthyism and communism. In 1959, he was appointed by the Democratic governor of the state of Pennsylvania as the first Democrat in Delaware County to be a judge on the Court of Common Pleas, a job that he kept for a couple of years until he was ousted in the next election by a Republican opponent. In 1966, Mildred retired, though Mildred never really retired, but she retired from the leadership, the official retiree of the leadership from the Women's International League. Just as the Vietnam War, protests against the Vietnam War were beginning to rise. One of the other issues, of course, from the 1950s onward and still today was the issue of the dangers of nuclear weapons, at the time atomic and hydrogen, and now nuclear weapons. And this was an issue that the Women's International League has also been very active in over the years. In the 1960s and 1970s, you'll see some of the documents and the cases. Mildred became very much involved with this national organization called the National Campaign for a Sane Nuclear Policy. Mostly as SANE, and still that, which is still active today, but under a new name called Peace Action. So the Women's International League had this sort of dual focus in the 1960s of the anti-nuclear movement, as well as protesting against the Vietnam War. Even just before her retirement, Mildred took up again the issue of connection to the Soviet Union. In 1961, the Women's International League sponsored a joint conference with the women from the Soviet Women's Peace Committee at Bryn Mawr College. This was unheard of, that civilians from an enemy nation, as the Soviet Union was considered, would actually meet on US soil. It was a step, and it probably was why the FBI looked again at Mildred in 1961, because here she was, the leader of an organization that was sponsoring maybe about 25 or 30 Soviet women at Bryn Mawr College. 3 years later, in 1964, a delegation of Women's International League members, included Mildred, and again you'll see some photographs of this, traveled to the Soviet Union and were met by President Khrushchev as well as Madame Khrushchev, and were touted as these international figures who were more interested in peace than continued war between the two countries. Mildred pretty much stayed active until the end of her life. Alan died in 1977. Mildred became known as really an elder stateswoman in her last years. In 1972, she was given an award by the Philadelphia Sejm for all of her work. In 1974, her alma mater, Smith College, gave her an honorary degree. In 1987, Swarthmore College also gave her an honorary degree. Alan also had gained awards for all of his work over the many years, and you can see some of these in the cases here. Mildred Scott Olmsted and Alan S. Olmsted knew they had considerable gifts in life. The gift of comfortable, loving families and upbringing, the gift of education well beyond that of most people in the first decades of the 20th century. Abilities to learn, to speak and write in ways to influence the people around them. They were both dedicated to social betterment and the world and changing the world around them. Both Mildred and Alan believed a better world was possible, but only if people, ordinary people, worked together to make those changes possible. Their lives reflected the history of the changes of the 20th century. Mildred Scott Olmsted and Alan S. Olmsted traveled the world to understand more about people and to achieve their dreams. And they returned always to the home they loved, here at Thunderbird Lodge and Rose Valley. Thank you.
Anybody want a thriller?
No. Yeah. Questions?
Yeah.
Anybody have any questions?
Yes.
If I understand or remember right, there was a time when the original owners, the Stevenses, Charles Stevens, was Barbara Stevens, lived in this with the Olmsteds.
Yes, and I think that
Yeah,
you might
I
know
know
what
the
is
answer to
divided.
Mildred and Alan moved into Thunderbird Lodge in 1924 as renters. They rented the house, and Stevensons moved into these two studios. Stevenson stayed here until both of them passed away. And by 1932 that had happened, and that's when the Olmsteds bought the property in total and took it over.
That's it.